Soulless Dead, Chapter 14, Soulless. Have you ever lied awake in your bed, looking up at the ceiling, unable to sleep? Though your mind is completely restless, your body is exhausted. Your arms are as limp as noodles, and your eyelids are weighing heavy from a long day of weariness, and they're trying to pull your eyelids shut and drag you to a long night's sleep. Like many nights, I would stay awake, unable to sleep, and many a time I could hear the gentle paddles of my ceiling fan moving air, nice cool air, wafting it towards me. Then I could hear the creakiness of the house moving in the wind, and occasionally the house moving or settling. The gentle creaks weren't really noticeable during the day, but at night they became more and more evident as the stillness of night crept in closer and closer. I would listen, and the cool, nice evening breezes would move the trees outside and rustle the leaves, and they would make an applause. That was quite relaxing to hear, unlike being in a stadium. Everything was calm and everything was quiet, and occasionally you'd hear somebody getting up to do whatever they needed to do at night, getting a midnight snack, or simply talking to somebody who got home late. I miss those nights when everything was quiet and still, and you didn't have to worry about anything. What was once the ticking of a grandfather clock is now the ticking of my life clock, seemingly counting down to zero, sooner and sooner. What was once sweet dreams of sitting on the beach or fishing out on a boat is now plagued with nightmares and recaps of all the horrible things that I've been doing. I sat in that room for what felt like hours. The light would flicker on and off because our wind generator wasn't picking up a lot of electricity that day. And so the flies would dink into it, move the light bulb slightly, and then it would flicker off, and they would fly around, and then the light would flicker back on and do the same over and over again. It was dark, and I would listen to what was going on, and I could hear the clip-clop of feet walking around on the tiled floors. And I could hear distant speaking, people talking and wandering around, the rustling of papers, possibly maps, and whatnot. I could hear the feedback of a radio, which I knew immediately where I was at that point. I was in the communications building, right next to the church. I didn't dare go up to the doors, figuring they probably bolted them until I cooled down, hoping that a demon like me would be consolable, for in every exorcism there has to be words to be spoke. All the poetics aside, I knew that I would have to answer for the little freak-out I had on the battlefield. I remember when I was a kid, I would get into an argument with somebody, believing that I was right, even when I was wrong. I would sit there and fight to the very bitter end. All the while knowing I was wrong, I would completely ignore the facts, as if I knew and ran the world. Later on, though, I would cool down and come to my senses, and then I would realize that I was wrong all along. Knowing that I was wrong, I would feel so defeated as to know that I could be wrong. A wave of discouragement would hit me quite hard, and of course everybody's been through it, so they know. I began to clean myself up a little bit, make myself more presentable. Luckily, there was a bucket of water sitting in one of the old sinks that had been decommissioned due to the power shortages and the loss of plumbing. I began to wash my face off and use a small piece of broken glass that I'd found on the floor. I looked at my face before I got most of it off, and I saw that I truly was in the wrong. The error of my ways had become physically evident as it was smeared all over me. As I tried to clean it off, it was even caked into my black gear. You would think because it wouldn't show, but as I moved my body, some of it would flake off in large amounts. It mixed with the water and create a brown sludge. I cleaned up and sat back down, and I was surprised that I wasn't bound or handcuffed. Most of my armor was still on, other than my armor piece for my chest that carried most of my magazines and handguns that I had carried with me. I was disarmed, and I knew that if I tried anything, I would probably end up dead. Not exactly the most honorable way to go out. Occasionally I would see the things, flashbacks, of all the things that I had done or been through, and they would plague me. I would twitch, wince my eyes as if I was to get my hand caught in a mousetrap. I would dart back and my hands would move quickly, as if I were reenacting everything. It seems as though the glove itself had taken on the aspect of the hand, and it began moving around its corpsey shell, remembering the movements of the hand that was once there. And that was my life. At least that's how it appeared. I could hear murmurs of people arguing, most likely about my foolish display that I had on the battlefield not a few hours ago. But honestly, I'd been in here so long in an ether, I couldn't tell you what was up and down or, well, if it was next week. I sat there for another 15 minutes, hoping that somebody would come through, but at the same time frightened of the verdict that they would drop upon me. Had I truly become too dangerous to be around people? Or was I just lucky enough to get the help that I so desperately needed? But all there was silence for so many hours. As I was dozing off, my head hanging and my neck straining to hold my head up, a man opened the door and walked in. The light was considerably brighter in the hallway. I had to briefly wince away, as the light had burned my eyes, in a poetic manner, so to speak. He walked in, they brought some chairs from one of the walls and set them down in front of me. They asked me if I was okay, if I needed anything, and I briefly answered no's and yeses, because at this point, I didn't want to seem like I was the aggressor in the situation. I could tell that they had their defenses up because, well, they had weapons, holstered but ready to go. I knew my situation wasn't exactly the brightest, so I had to go with it. They began asking me what had happened on the battlefield, why I had done what I did. I explained to them over the last few months that I'd been suffering from stress, trauma, and the things that I've seen, and these were more relatively newer leaders in the group. Some were ex-military, some were doctors, and wasn't sure who these two guys were, totally. I was bad like that for remembering people. A shameful chapter of myself, to be honest. They were definitely very cautious with the questions they asked, but I explained to them that I really had no reason to attack them, for they weren't aggressors anyway. I asked them one question is, how were the men doing? Was the battle won? They briefly looked at each other, whispered something to each other, as if they were full of apprehension to explain to me the situation. My gut sank as I began to go through scenarios where my people actually lost as I left, as if I was some sort of driving cog. Of course, if it was a real army, we probably would have lost morale after seeing their small-time leader lose his dang mind in front of everybody. And that shame began to sink in even more. I began going through scenarios whether or not my friends were face down in a ditch with a pistol round in the back of their head, or they were bogged down to where they couldn't get away and running out of ammo and food to protect them. They looked at me and began to say that they had won the battle, they had liberated many people, and that a lot of trucks had already come and go. There were a lot of people and there were a lot of questions, and unfortunately the people that we were going to question were killed. They briefly paused before they finished the sentence, and I looked at them as to continue what they were saying, to dictate to me that it was all my fault. I got my wish soon enough. They explained that the men that I had so brutally killed were important people. There was a reason why they had set aside, but I was not informed of this. Being one of the 4 military leaders in the group, I asked them why I wasn't told. They told me that they feared that I would not be combat effective. I gritted my teeth and began to get angry. They could tell as one of the small-time men put his hand next to his handgun. I told them that wouldn't be necessary, and I asked them why wouldn't I be told. Again, they gave me the same answer, that I could be compromised, I wasn't trained. And then I rebutted, in a very vindictive manner, that I was the one that saved these people, that brought them here to this haven. If I was not to be trusted, then who could be? Feeling selfish, I began to brag that this was my town. I was the one that was keeping people safe long before you men showed up. Then again, those words were both contradictory and very true at the same time. I felt the truth of them and the weight that I had gained to myself for the longest time, the burden that I had caused myself. But at the same time, I knew that the works that I had done were definitely worth it and worthy of merit. The men again relaxed and began to talk. Said that I was young, I didn't really know anything, but I told them that there were plenty of soldiers, plenty of people that joined the military young, but made great decisions. Again, they really didn't have a rebuttal for that. They just sat there and began to explain more. We lost close to 15 men and women, but we had gained a number of people. A lot of people were hidden in other places around the property. They said there were people tied up in sheds, and there were other people in other parts of the factory that we had not yet explored. Most of the guards had left and ran in a haste, but were shot or cut down quite quickly on the perimeter by one of the squadrons. They said they had all but moved all their people in. Other people were still on patrols, just to be sure that we were not being pursued on the way home. I was upset, they could tell, because I wasn't there with my men. They said I had suffered from a psychological episode, possibly PTSD, schizophrenia, or any number of problems. I asked them a simple question. Before they were in this situation, what did they do? One of them answered that he was a TV salesman, and the other one took time, and he looked up and he said that he worked for the county clerk's office. And yet these two men were lecturing me, and yet I've saved all these people. I didn't dare get angry because I knew that the odds were stacked against me. Not so much as a knife on my body. I knew I wouldn't be able to fight both these men with the amount of wounds that I had, which I had been completely ignoring. The amount of adrenaline that I was on apparently started to wear down, and I began to wince and lean over to grab my leg. It began to get infected. It was very difficult to breathe, and I was stifled. One of the men had motioned and yelled out for someone to come in. A nurse had come in and began to work on me, placing antiseptic and all kinds of bandages on my leg, cleaning it up and sewing it shut. They began to give me the skinny on what was going on and whether or not I should have a trial or some sort of lawyer to explain my situation. I looked down and briefly pushed the hands of the nurse away and stood up, stifling myself as I began to stumble due to my leg's weakness. Still looking at the ground, I told them that I didn't need help. If I was a threat, then why didn't they say something before? The men again looked at each other with a bit of puzzle, not sure what to say, but they said that a lot of people were worried, including the council and some of the other leaders, and even some of your friends. I looked at them sharply and asked them what did they know? Who were they to incarcerate me? What man can prepare for horrors of battle, or the horrors of the worst that man can throw at each other? Again, they were speechless. I then continued. I told them that there was no way that any man could totally prepare for this, let alone watching your neighbors and your friends eat each other alive. There are no more trucks. The power plants have all but shut down. Explosions have been going off because of the neglect. We think we have the dead in check, but all it takes is one large herd of them to start walking one direction. And to top it off, we have people that run around hurting and injuring and torturing children and other human beings that could possibly save them. And you're telling me that I'm the threat because of one situation. One of the men got a little more bold and brazen. And he said, according to this, there's been more than one situation where you have been called into question. I told him to sit down, as I sharply sneered at him. He sat down immediately, and I told him that it wasn't his place to say anything. I had seen his face before, and I knew that he hadn't been with us more than a month, and yet he's already got this position of power. There would be no such disorder in my place, no such to ruin my work. And I made sure that he knew. I began to get upset, and I started yelling and incoherently throwing daggers at everybody, so to speak. The men both stood up and began to try to restrain me, getting me to calm down. Still having my armed guards, I grabbed one of their hands, pulled them in, and put my elbow into his face, knocked him over. All the while, I grabbed his pistol. The other man began to draw his handgun, but it got caught on the holster. I hit him in the arm with my forearm covered in the armor. His hand stunned, and he moved back, and I hit him in the throat with the open hand of my palm. He dropped to the floor, passed out. The nurse ran out of the room, and I grabbed both of their handguns, took the handcuffs off of their belts, and put them on each other. I ran out the front door. As I did, I saw a box where my stuff was being placed, and I grabbed it, ran as fast as I could, grabbing a small pickup truck. A couple of the men had been working on it and been unloading it, and I pulled out a handgun and placed it at one of their heads, telling them to get off. Of course, a few of them had known me by name. Again, my name memory isn't the best. They said, "I thought you were in jail. I thought they had taken care of you." I said, "Get out of the truck now and move." They got off, raising their hands as if they didn't have a weapon. I got in the truck and took off. As I looked in the rearview mirror, they began to run to go get more people. I had finally made my way to the small airfield that I'd become acquainted with as to help it and to get it ready. One of the pilots was cleaning off the plane for the last of the day and refueling it. I pulled out my gun and told him to get into the plane and get ready to take off. He was a good pal of mine. His name was Jerry Mathers. We had picked him up at the Cessna plant, and he was the man that helped me get into the battlefield in the first place. He told me to relax and take it easy, but I told him to start the plane. He could see the desperation in my eyes, the shaking. I was sweating like a pig, and I had my armor barely placed on. He knew that he could see by my face and by the look of me and the state I was in that I was on the run. He placed his hands up and said, "Okay," in a calm manner, and began to start the plane. I hopped in. I grabbed a duffel bag of supplies that was just sitting next there, and I grabbed a small first aid kit off the side of the plane, on the inside of the fuselage. Placed it in the duffel bag, and we got to take off. We began flying, and as we did, I could see some trucks pulling up quite fast and beginning to aim their guns. As I looked down, I could briefly see some of the leaders tell them to put their guns down. We flew for about 15 minutes, and I told them to set it down in a small field where we had set down before next to the artillery crew. There weren't a lot of them there, so it wasn't a big deal. As soon as I limped out of the plane, he asked me to take it easy and just to come back with him, that we can explain this and that it wouldn't be a big deal, but I told him that's not how it's going to work. He told me, "What do I tell them? What do I tell your family and your friends?" I said to him, "Tell them nothing. What I need is silence."